You would not last a single winter. That is not an insult. It is simply the truth, and it is worth saying plainly at the start, because we have all grown up with a picture of the Vikings that is mostly wrong. We picture tall, golden warriors in horned helmets, sailing off to glory, feasting in great halls, living wild and free under the northern sky. And there is a little truth in it, buried under a great deal of nonsense. But the reality of that world, the actual daily fact of being alive in the cold lands of the North 1200 years ago, was so hard, so relentless, so utterly without mercy, that almost none of us, dropped into it, would see the spring. Tonight, and across the nights that follow, we are going to find out exactly why. We are going to take you, a person of the modern world, soft in all the ways that comfort makes us soft. And we are going to set you down in that world and walk you through everything in it that would try to kill you. The cold, the sea, the hunger, the sickness, the violence, the gods who demanded blood, the sheer grinding labor of simply staying alive. And by the end, you will understand something that the horned helmets and the movies never tell you, which is that the Vikings were not remarkable because they were violent. They were remarkable because they survived it all, in a world that was trying every single day to end them. And let us clear away first the biggest piece of nonsense of all, because it matters: the horned helmets. They never wore them. Not one Viking ever went into battle with horns on his helmet. It is pure invention, dreamed up by artists and opera designers many centuries later. And it has stuck so hard that it is now the first thing anyone thinks of. A real Viking helmet, when a warrior was lucky enough to own one at all, was a plain, practical cap of iron, close-fitting, designed to turn a blade, with nothing on it that an enemy could grab. And that small correction opens the door to the larger truth. Almost everything you think you know about these people is a costume, a story told long after they were gone. The reality was harder, poorer, colder, and far more human than the legend. Most of them were not warriors at all. Most of them never sailed off to raid anything. Most of them were farmers and fishers and herders, scratching a living from a hard land, and the raiding, when it happened, was done by a minority in the summer, as one desperate way among many to get the wealth that the poor northern soil could not provide. So when we ask whether you would survive as a Viking, we are mostly not asking whether you could win a battle. We are asking whether you could live the life, the ordinary, grinding, freezing, hungry, laborious life of an ordinary person in the far north 1200 years ago. And the answer, I am sorry to say, is almost certainly not. But before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the harsh and distant past bring you some peace at the end of your own day, warm and safe and far from all of this, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would love to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, in whatever warm and comfortable corner of the world you happen to be, where are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is a lovely thing to see all the places and all the hours, all of us drifting off together, safe and warm, while the cold old world of long ago turns quietly in our minds. And now, let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and pull the blankets a little closer, because we are going somewhere very cold. Come with me, back more than 1,000 years, to the lands of the North, to the world of the Vikings, and let us find out gently why you would not have survived there. Let us begin with the land itself, because the land is where it starts, and the land was hard. Picture the home of the Vikings, not a single country, but a scatter of lands around the cold northern seas. The long fractured coast of the fjords, the islands, the forests, the mountains. It is a place of savage beauty and savage difficulty. Much of it is rock and mountain and dark forest, with only thin ribbons of good land along the water and in the valleys, where anything could be grown at all. The growing season is short, terribly short, a brief green summer squeezed between long grey springs and killing winters, and the winters. The winters in the north are not like the winters most of us know. They are long, and they are dark, truly dark. For in the far north, the sun barely rises at all for weeks on end, and the world lies under a heavy blanket of snow and ice, and endless night, month after month, while the cold sinks into everything, into the walls, into the bones, into the soul. To live there at all, you had to wring your survival out of a hard land by endless labor, and you had to store up enough in the short summer to carry you through the long, dead winter. And if you failed, if the harvest was poor or the stores ran short or the winter ran long, then you starved in the dark in the cold, and there was no help coming, because everyone around you was in exactly the same desperate state. Now, you, a modern person, would already be in trouble, and we have not even reached the hard part yet, because you have never been truly cold. Not really. You think you have on a bad day waiting for a bus, but you have always had a warm room to return to, a coat made in a factory, heating at the turn of a dial. You have never lived day and night, week after week, in a cold that never lifts, with nothing between you and it but a fire you must feed, and clothes you must make by hand from the wool of your own sheep. And the clothes themselves would not save you the way you imagine. You picture perhaps thick furs and heavy cloaks, and those existed, but they were precious and hard-won, and never enough. Most of what a Viking wore was wool, layer upon layer of it, spun and woven and sewn by hand, and wool is a wonderful thing, warm even when wet, but it is not the sealed and engineered warmth of a modern coat. When the wind came off the ice, it found its way through. When you worked and sweated and then stopped, the damp cold crept in and settled in your chest. There were no waterproofs. When it rained, you got wet and stayed wet, and the wet in that cold is what kills you, drawing the heat out of your body faster than you can make it, until your hands stop working and your thinking slows and you lie down, strangely warm at the end, and do not get up. The cold did not need a storm to kill you. It could do it on an ordinary grey afternoon if you were careless or unlucky, or simply too far from a fire. The Viking house was a single long room, built low and strong against the weather, with walls of turf or timber and a roof of thatch or sod, sometimes with the earth itself banked up against the walls for warmth, and down the center of that one long room ran the fire, the hearth, the heart of the home. And it burned day and night all winter long, because to let it die was to die. The whole family lived in that one smoky room. They cooked over that fire, and ate around it, and worked around it, and slept along the walls beside it. On benches, under piles of furs and woolen blankets, the whole household together, humans and often the animals too, brought inside in the worst of the winter to share the warmth and to keep them from freezing. And it was dark, and it was smoky. There was no chimney, only a hole in the roof to let some of the smoke escape, and it never let out enough, so the air inside was thick with wood smoke that stung the eyes and blackened the lungs, and the light was only the red glow of the fire and the small flames of oil lamps burning fish oil or animal fat, which stank and smoked and gave a light so dim you could barely see across the room. We know from their bones and their remains that these people suffered terribly from the smoke. Their lungs blackened, their eyes weakened, but the alternative to the smoke was the cold, and the cold was death, so they breathed the smoke all their lives and called it home. And there was no privacy in that world, none at all, another thing that would be strange and hard for you. The whole household slept in that one long room, everyone together, the family and the servants and the thralls, the slaves and any guests, all along the benches by the walls, in the dark a few feet from one another. Everything happened there. Birth and death, love and quarrel, sickness and health, all of it in that one shared space, in the smoke and the dim light, with the animals stamping and breathing at the far end, and the wind at the walls. There was no room of your own to retreat to, no door to close, no moment truly alone, not in the depth of winter. You lived your whole life pressed close against other people, and if you could not bear that, if you needed solitude and silence and space the way modern people do, that world would have pressed on you like a weight all winter long in the dark. Could you do it? Could you sit night after night through a winter half a year long in a dark, smoky room, in clothes you had made yourself from raw wool, with the cold pressing at the walls and the wind howling outside and the dark pressing down, with nothing to do but the endless handwork of survival? No light to read by, even if you could read. No world beyond the one room and the few people in it, for month after month after month. Most of us would lose our minds. They did not, because they had never known anything else, and because the work never stopped. And the work was the thing that kept you alive. Rest there a moment, though, in that dark, warm room, because there is a strange coziness in it too. And the Vikings knew that as well. The fire glowing, the furs heavy and warm, the family close around you in the dark. The storm shut safely outside. There is a word that comes down to us from those northern peoples, a word for exactly this, the deep warm contentment of being safe and warm and together while the cold rages outside, and it is one of the gifts they left us. So feel that, for a moment, the good side of it, the warmth at the heart of the cold, and then remember what it cost to have it, and how easily it could be lost. Because now let us talk about the work, and the work is the thing that would break you. There was no rest in that world. None. The idea of leisure as we know it, of days off, of free time, of simply doing nothing, would have been almost incomprehensible to them, because survival demanded labor from every person, every day, from the moment they were old enough to be useful until the day they died or grew too broken to work. And the work was hard, physical, bone-grinding labor, the kind that wears a body out and ages it fast and leaves its marks on the very skeleton. Consider the farm, because most Vikings were farmers, not raiders, whatever the stories say. The great majority of them lived and died on the land, working the soil, keeping the animals, and it never stopped. In the brief summer, you worked from before dawn until after dark, because the growing season was so short that every hour of light mattered. You plowed the thin, hard soil, often by hand, or behind an ox if you were fortunate. You planted, you weeded, you tended. You cut the hay, and the hay was everything, because the hay was what kept your animals alive through the winter, and if you did not cut and dry and store enough hay in the short summer, your animals would starve in the winter, and then you would starve too. So you cut grass with a hand blade bent double for weeks, racing the weather, and you dried it, and you carried it in, and you built your defense against the coming dark, one armful of grass at a time. And the animals, the cattle, the sheep, the goats, the pigs, the chickens, all of them needing care every single day, fed and watered and milked and mucked out and watched over in all weather forever. The sheep gave the wool that became the clothing, and the clothing was made entirely by hand. And this is a thing almost no modern person understands. Every thread of cloth in that world was made by human hands, from the raw wool spun into yarn on a spindle, a task that never ended, that women did constantly, walking, sitting, talking, always spinning, because it took so much spun yarn to make cloth, and then the yarn was woven into cloth on a loom slowly, painstakingly, and then the cloth was cut and sewn into clothes. A single sail for a single ship might take the wool of hundreds of sheep and years of a woman's spinning and weaving. Every shirt on every back represented weeks and months of human labor. You, who buy a shirt without a thought, would have to learn to make your own from a living sheep, and you would fail and you would be cold. And then there was the fuel, the wood and the fire, which was its own endless labor, and its own matter of life and death. That fire in the middle of the longhouse, the one that could never be allowed to die, had to be fed all winter, day and night. And that meant wood, mountains of wood, and someone had to cut it and split it and haul it and stack it and dry it through the year so that it was ready when the cold came. In the treeless places, in the far islands where no forest grew, they burned dried dung and peat cut from the bogs, gathered and dried through the summer in a race against the coming winter, another crushing labor with death at the end of it if you fell short. Cold was not an inconvenience there. Cold was the enemy that never slept, and the war against it never ended, and it was fought with an axe and a strong back and endless hours of labor, all so that one small fire could keep burning in the dark. And you would have to do all of this, remember, while cold and often hungry, and in the failing light of the short northern day, with your body aching from the work of the day before, and no prospect of rest, and no end to it, ever, until you died. The bones of these people, when we dig them up, tell the story plainly. They are marked by heavy labor from childhood, worn and damaged, the joints ground down, the spines bent, the muscles' anchors thickened by strain. They worked themselves quite literally into their graves, and they did it because the alternative was to freeze or to starve, and there was no third choice. And that is only the beginning of the women's work, and I want to stop here because the stories give all the glory to the raiding men, and forget that the whole world rested on the labor of the women, and that labor was crushing. A Viking woman ran the household, and the household was a small factory of survival. She made the cloth, as we have said. She made the clothes. She prepared and cooked all the food over the open fire, without any of the tools we take for granted. She preserved food for the winter, salting and drying and smoking the meat and fish that would keep the family alive through the dead months. And if she did it wrong, if the food spoiled, the family died. She brewed the ale, which was safer to drink than much of the water. She made butter and cheese. She bore the children, many children, in a world without medicine, and raised them, and buried the many who died. She tended the sick, and when the men were away, raiding or trading or fighting for months at a time, she ran the entire farm alone, every part of it, and held the whole thing together. The Viking woman was not a delicate creature waiting at home. She was the load-bearing wall of the entire civilization, and the work would have destroyed almost any of us within a month. And here is a thing that may surprise you, given all we have said about the cold and the smoke and the hardship. The Vikings were, by the standards of their age, remarkably clean. They washed, they combed their hair, and we have found their combs, thousands of them, beautifully made of bone and antler, for they cared about their appearance. They bathed when they could, and some of them, it was said, bathed once a week, which scandalized their neighbors to the south, who thought it a strange and excessive vanity. They were not the filthy savages of the legend, but being clean by the standards of that world is not the same as being safe from what we now know lurks in dirt and water and close living. They had no idea what truly caused disease. They lived crowded together with their animals, drank from sources that could carry sickness, had no way to keep a wound from turning bad, and no understanding at all of the invisible things that killed them. Their cleanliness was a matter of pride and comfort, not of medicine, and it could not protect them from the real dangers, which they could not see and did not understand. Could you spin wool into yarn hour after hour, for years, until your hands knew it in their sleep? Could you deliver a calf in the freezing dark of a winter barn, or salt a winter's worth of fish so that not one batch spoiled, or keep a fire alive through a 6-month winter without ever once letting it die? Because if you could not do these things and do them well and do them every single day, you would not survive, and neither would anyone who depended on you. And through all of it, remember, there was the cold, and there was the dark, and there was the ever-present nearness of hunger, and there was no rest and no help and no escape. That was the ordinary daily texture of Viking life. Before we have even mentioned a single sword or a single raid, just the land and the cold, and the endless labor of staying alive on it. And most of us dropped into that, soft and unskilled and unaccustomed to true hardship, would be dead before we ever saw a longship, killed not by an enemy but simply by the world itself, by the cold and the work and the hunger, by the sheer unrelenting difficulty of being alive in the north. Let us talk about the food, because you would be hungry and you would not like what there was, and in the bad times there would be none of it at all. There was no variety in a Viking's diet, not the way we know it. What you ate was what the land and the sea near you could give, and what you had managed to store. In the good months it was not so bad. There was fish, endless fish, fresh from the sea and the rivers, and this was the backbone of survival in many places. There was the meat of the animals, though you did not kill your precious livestock lightly, for a cow or a sheep was worth far more alive, giving milk and wool and young, than it was as a single meal. There was milk, and from it butter and cheese and soured milk products that would keep. There was bread, coarse and heavy and dark, made from what grains could be grown in that hard soil, barley and oats and rye, ground between stones, and that grinding, by the way, filled the bread with grit that wore people's teeth down to painful stumps by middle age. There were a few vegetables, the hardy ones, cabbages and onions and peas and beans. There were wild things gathered in season, berries, nuts, birds' eggs, seaweed from the shore, and there was ale, brewed strong, drunk by everyone, because it was safer than water, and gave warmth and comfort in the dark. And some of it, honestly, you might not be able to stomach at all, softened as you are by a lifetime of gentle food. To make the fish last, they preserved it in ways that produced things a modern person can barely bring themselves to smell. Fish fermented and buried and aged, until it was strong enough to make your eyes water. A taste built by necessity, and then, over generations, actually loved. They ate parts of the animal we throw away without thinking, every scrap of it, because to waste any of a slaughtered beast was to throw away survival. The blood made into puddings, the organs, the head, the feet, the fat. All of it used, all of it eaten. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. You would sit at that table, hungry as you were, and be served things that your whole life had not prepared you to eat, and you would either learn to eat them or you would go without, and going without in that world was how you died. But the good months were short, and the food had to be made to last through the long dead winter, and this is where it became a matter of life and death. Everything was about preserving. The autumn was a frantic race to put away enough food to survive until spring. Meat and fish were salted, or smoked over the fire, or dried hard in the wind, or soured, or buried, anything to keep it from rotting, because whatever you failed to preserve, you would not have, and there was no market to buy more, no shop, no help. You lived all winter on what you had stored in the autumn, and not one bite more. And if the harvest had been poor, or the fishing bad, or the winter longer than the stores could stretch to cover, then you starved. This was the thing that hung over every single winter, the fear beneath everything. The stores running out before the spring came. And in a bad year, a year when the crops failed or the weather turned against you, whole families, whole districts could starve to death. Slowly, in the cold and the dark, watching their small store of food dwindle day by day, eating less and less, then eating the animals they could not afford to keep alive, then eating things you would never call food, boiling bark and bones and leather, anything to fill the belly, while the weakest, the children and the old, faded and died one by one. And there was nothing to be done but wait, and hope the spring came before the last of them was gone. That was the real face of hunger in the Viking world, not a missed meal, the slow closing in of starvation, through the long dark with no help coming. And there was a particular cruelty in the timing of it. The most dangerous time was not the depth of winter, when the stores were still holding. It was the very end, the early spring, when the winter had gone on, and the food was nearly gone, and the new growth had not yet come. They had a grimness about that season, the hungry gap, the weeks when the old year's food was spent and the new year's was not yet ready, and it was then, so often, right at the edge of survival, with spring almost in sight, that the week finally slipped away. To have endured the whole winter, the whole dark, and then to die in the last cold weeks before the green returned, that was the shape of so many endings in that world. And you would have no way of knowing, through the winter, whether your stores would carry you across that gap or leave you short right at the end. And there would be nothing to do but eat a little less each day and wait and find out. Could you face that? Could you look at your winter store in the autumn and know in your bones how to make it last exactly to the day the new food came? Could you ration a family through a hungry spring, deciding who ate and who went without? Because a single mistake, a store misjudged, a batch of fish that spoiled, a winter a few weeks too long, and it was not hardship. It was death, for you and everyone who depended on you. Now let me tell you about being born there, because your troubles would begin before you could even walk, and this is one of the hardest truths of that whole world. To be born a Viking was to face death immediately. The world into which a Viking child arrived was one without any real medicine, without any understanding of infection or germs, without any of the knowledge that keeps our own children alive. And so children died, in numbers that are hard for us even to comprehend. Perhaps half of all children born did not live to grow up. Half, think about that. A mother might bear 7, 8, 9 children across her life and simply expect, as a normal fact of existence, to bury half of them or more. They died of sicknesses we now cure with a spoonful of medicine. They died of the cold. They died of hunger in the bad winters, the little ones always the first to go. They died of infections from small wounds. They were carried off by fevers no one could name or fight. And because so many died, there was a custom in that world that is very hard for us to hear, and I will tell it gently. When a child was born, it was not automatically kept. The newborn was brought to the father, and he decided whether the family could afford to raise it, whether it was strong enough, whether it was whole. And if the answer was no, if the child was sickly or deformed, or if it was simply a hungry year and there was not enough food to feed another mouth, the child might be carried out and left in the cold to die, exposed, abandoned to the wilderness. It was not done from cruelty. It was done from a desperate, terrible arithmetic in a world where keeping a child that could not be fed meant risking the lives of all the others. But it was real, and it was common, and it is a measure of just how hard that world was. That the first test of your life before you had drawn more than a few breaths was whether you would be allowed to live at all. And if you passed that first test and were kept, you then had to survive childhood itself in that cold, hungry, dangerous world, with death waiting at every turn, through every winter, every fever, every hungry spring when the winter stores ran out before the new food grew. To reach adulthood at all in the Viking world was an achievement, a thing that only happened to the lucky and the strong. By the time a Viking stood before you as a grown warrior, tall and hard and scarred, that person had already survived a gauntlet that had killed half the children born alongside them. They were, quite simply, the ones who had not died. And you, soft child of a soft age, kept alive through your own childhood by medicines and warmth and plenty that they could not have dreamed of, would very likely not have been among the survivors. And it was not only the children who died. To give birth in that world was one of the most dangerous things a person could do, and the mothers died too, in terrible numbers, of things we now prevent without a second thought. There was no help for a birth that went wrong, no way to stop the bleeding, no way to fight the fever that so often came after, no understanding of the cleanliness that would have saved so many. A woman entering childbirth in the Viking age was walking up to the edge of death, and doing it again and again across her life, each time not knowing if she would come back. We find them in the graves, young women, buried sometimes with the tiny bones of the child that killed them still with them. That was the price of bringing the next generation into that world, paid by the women over and over, and it was a price that a great many of them did not survive. Rest there a moment gently, because this is a heavy thing to carry, and I do not want to leave you in the cold of it. Think instead of what it means. Every Viking who ever lived to raise a sword, or sail a ship, or tell a tale by the fire, was a survivor of that gauntlet, one of the strong ones, hardened by a childhood most of us cannot imagine. It gives you a kind of respect for them, does it not? That goes deeper than the horns and the swords. They earned their lives every day from the very first day. Nothing was given, everything was survived. Now, there is one more thing about that world you would need to understand to survive in it. And it is not about the cold or the hunger, but about the people. And it might be the thing that would trip you up fastest of all. There was no one to protect you. We live our lives inside a great invisible web of protection. There is a police force somewhere, and a law and a court, and a whole apparatus of the state that stands, however imperfectly, between us and the violence of other people. If someone wrongs you, you do not have to answer it yourself. There is a system. In the Viking world, there was no such thing. There was no police. There was no state that would protect you. There was law, and they took their law seriously, gathering in assemblies to settle disputes and declare judgments, but there was no one whose job it was to enforce it for you. If a judgment was made in your favor, you and your family had to make it stick yourselves by force if it came to that, which meant that your safety, your very life, depended on two things. And if you had neither, you were as good as dead. The first was your family, your kin, the people bound to you by blood who were obliged to stand with you, to avenge you if you were killed, to back you in every quarrel. A person alone, without kin, was terribly vulnerable, for anyone could wrong them and fear no consequence. The second was your own reputation, your honor, your standing as a person not to be trifled with. In a world without police, the thing that kept people from killing you or robbing you or taking what was yours was the knowledge that you and your family would make them pay for it. Your reputation was your armor. To be known as someone who would let an insult pass, who would not defend what was theirs, who could be pushed, was to invite everyone to push and take, and eventually to destroy you. Do you see how dangerous that would be for you, a modern person, raised to turn the other cheek, to call for help, to let the authorities handle it? In that world, letting a wrong pass could be fatal, not just to your pride, but to your actual survival, because it marked you as weak, and the weak did not last. You would have to learn to stand your ground, to answer insults, to be prepared to back your words with your body, in a way that would feel monstrous and terrifying to you, and that they simply understood as the price of staying alive among other human beings when there was no law, but the law you enforced yourself. And you would probably get it wrong. You would let the wrong thing pass, or answer the wrong thing too hard, and either way it could cost you everything. And there was a fate worse than death waiting in that world, one we have barely touched, and it is one you might very well fall into. Slavery. The Viking world ran in large part on slaves, on the unfree, whom they called thralls. A great many of the people in that society owned nothing, not even themselves. Some were born into it. Many more were made slaves by capture, taken in the raids and the wars, carried off from their homes across the sea and sold. For the trade in human beings was one of the great businesses of the Viking Age, and the raids you have heard of were, as much as anything, slave raids, seizing people to sell. And a thrall's life was the hardest of all. They did the worst of the work, the endless, filthy, grinding labor, the hauling and the digging and the mucking and the drudgery, from before dawn until after dark. And they owned nothing, and they had no rights worth the name, and they could be bought and sold and beaten and worked to death. And in the very worst of it, a slave might even be killed to accompany a dead master into the next world, sacrificed at the funeral, buried or burned alongside the body of the one who had owned them, so that they might serve them still in death. And here is the thing you must understand. Dropped into that world as you are, a stranger, with no kin to stand for you, no reputation, no land, no skills that world would value, unable even to speak the tongue properly, you would be worth nothing as a free person and a great deal as a thrall. The likeliest fate for a soft, friendless, useless stranger in the Viking world was not to become a warrior or a farmer at all. It was to become someone's property, to be taken and sold and worked in the cold and the dark, until the labor and the hardship wore you out and you died, unmourned, far from home. That is the truth that the horned helmets never tell you. Most people in that world were not the raiders. Many were the raided and the owned and the worked to death, and you, of all people, would most likely have been among them. We have only just begun. We have not yet spoken of the sea that would drown you, or the wars that would cut you down, or the gods who would demand your blood, or the diseases that would rot you from within. We have only walked, so far, through the ordinary world, the cold and the work and the hunger and the simple brutal fact of staying alive on that hard northern land. And already, if we are honest, you would not have made it. Already the winter or the labor or the hunger or the sickness of childhood would most likely have taken you quietly, without a single enemy ever raising a hand. But we will go on next time, to the sea and to the violence, and to all the sharper ways that world had of ending a life. For now, though, let the cold old world rest, and rest yourself with it, safe and warm, so very far from all of this, in your own soft and gentle age. So let your breathing slow, and pull the blankets close, and be glad, deeply glad of the warmth around you, of the roof that needs no tending, of the fire that burns at the turn of a dial, of the food that waits without a winter's labor, of the medicine that kept you alive when the old world would have let you go. Feel how fortunate you are, how impossibly lucky to live when you live, and where you live, warm and safe and fed, and spare a quiet thought as you drift off for those hard people of the cold north long ago, who lived through what would have ended us, who fed their fires through the endless dark, and spun their wool by the dim red light, and buried their children, and survived and endured, and even now and then in the warm heart of the cold were happy. They are all gone now, every one of them, at rest for 1,000 years, their long winters over, their fires long cold. Let them rest, and rest yourself, warm and safe, and sleep. Let the cold stay outside tonight, far away on the other side of 1,000 years. Let the long, dark winters of the north lie where they belong, in the deep past. Done and finished, harming no one now. Let the fjords lie still and black under the stars, and the empty longhouses sink slowly back into the earth, and the old hard world grow quiet and quieter and fade. There is nothing you need to carry from it. You do not have to cut the hay or feed the fire or salt the fish or fear the spring. It was all so very long ago. Everyone who bore it has laid their burdens down at last, and been at peace for longer than we can imagine. And it is only a story now, a slow, cold, quiet story to make you grateful for your warm bed and carry you gently down into sleep. So let your breathing slow, let the fire burn low in your mind and the furs grow heavy, and the storm blow itself out somewhere far away. You are warm, you are safe, you are fed. You are here, in your own kind age, and the long winter of the Vikings is over, and has been over for a very long time. Sleep now. The cold cannot reach you, it never could. Last time we left you alive. Barely. We set you down in the cold world of the north, and we walked you through everything in the ordinary daily life of it that would have killed you. And there was a great deal. The cold, the endless labor, the hunger that waited at the end of every winter, the sickness of childhood that took half of those born. And we said at the end that even if none of the sharper dangers ever found you, even if you never saw an enemy at all, the world itself, the plain hard fact of surviving in that place, would most likely have finished you before you ever laid eyes on a longship. But tonight, we come to the longship. Tonight we come to the sharper dangers. The sea that would drown you, the raids and the wars that would cut you down, the gods who wanted your blood, and the terrible code of honor that could get you killed for a word spoken wrong. This is the part of the Viking world that the stories are made of, and the truth of it is both less glamorous and far more deadly than the stories let on. But before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the hard old world help you find some peace at the end of your day, safe and warm and far from any of it, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would love to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, in whatever gentle corner of the world has you, where are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is a quiet joy to see all the places and all the hours, all of us gathered here together in the warm, while the cold old world turns on in the dark. And now, let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and let the day fall away from you. Come with me back to the north, and down to the water's edge, where the long ships wait, and let us find out all the sharper ways that world had of ending a life like yours. Let us begin with the sea, because the sea was everything to them, and the sea would kill you without a second thought. The Vikings were, above all, people of the water. Their homeland was a place of fjords and islands and endless coast, where the sea was not a barrier but a road, the great highway that connected everything, and they became the finest sailors the world had yet seen. Their ships are rightly famous, and they were beautiful things and clever beyond anything their neighbors could build, long and slender and shallow and flexible, built to bend with the waves rather than fight them, driven by a great square sail and by oars when the wind failed, light enough to be dragged overland or rowed far up a shallow river, strong enough somehow to cross the open ocean. In those ships they went everywhere. They reached lands unimaginably far from home. They crossed seas no one had thought could be crossed, and the distances are almost beyond belief. They sailed west across the whole of the Northern Ocean and found and settled cold islands no one had ever lived on before, and went on beyond them to a vast frozen land at the edge of the world, and then on again, across even that, to touch the shores of a whole new continent, 500 years before anyone else from their part of the world would find it. They rowed their ships up the great rivers deep into the east, and carried them overland between the waters, and came down at last to the shores of distant southern seas, to the walls of the greatest and richest cities of the age. A people from a scatter of cold northern farms reached, in their open boats, from the edge of the new world in the west to the great markets of the east. It was one of the great feats of seamanship in all of human history, and they did it in open boats, with no compass, no charts, no instruments to speak of, navigating by the sun and the stars, and the color of the water and the flight of birds and a deep hard-won knowledge of the sea, passed down and held in the mind. Think about that for a moment, because it is worth dwelling on. To cross a great stretch of open ocean, out of sight of land for days, and to arrive where you meant to arrive with no instrument of any kind, is a thing that seems almost impossible. They did it by reading the world with a skill we have entirely lost. They knew the sun's height and its path. They watched the stars. They read the long ocean swells, the great waves that run in steady patterns across the sea, and could feel from the motion of the ship whether they held their course. They watched the birds, knowing which ones flew out from land and which stayed far out to sea, and released birds to see which way they flew toward the nearest shore. They read the color of the water, the drift of weed, the presence of whales, the shapes of the clouds that gather over distant land. It was knowledge built over generations, held in the heads of the finest navigators, and it was as precious as gold because lives depended on it. And you, of course, would have none of it. Set adrift in that world, you would not have the faintest idea where you were or which way was home, and you would be utterly at the mercy of the sea and the few who could read it, and it killed them constantly. That is the thing to understand. For every voyage that became a saga, there were others that simply vanished. Ships that set out and were never seen again, swallowed by storms, driven onto rocks, lost in the fog, capsized in the great cold waves. Their crews drowned in water so cold it stops the heart in minutes. There was no rescue. If your ship went down in the open sea, you died, all of you, and no one ever knew quite where or how. Whole crews, whole families setting out to settle new land simply disappeared into the grey water and were never heard of again. The sea roads they travelled were paved invisibly with the drowned. And picture the storm itself, because that is how so many of them died. You are far out of sight of any land in your open boat, and the weather turns. The sky goes black. The wind rises to a scream, and the sea, which was rolling before, begins to heave up into great moving mountains of grey water, taller than the ship, and the little vessel is lifted up the face of them and dropped down the far side into the trough over and over, while the wind tears the tops off the waves and hurls the freezing spray horizontally into your face. The sail must come down, or it will drive you under. The water pours in over the sides, and everyone who is not doing something else is bailing for their lives, flinging the water back out with buckets and helmets and bare hands, while the ship groans and flexes and threatens to come apart, and there is nothing around you, no land, no help, no hope of rescue, only the black sky and the mountains of water and the shrieking wind and the desperate labor of staying afloat one more minute, and then one more. Some of them lived through that. Many did not. And you, clinging to the wet wood, sick with terror, no use to anyone, would simply be waiting to find out which. And think about what the voyage itself was actually like, because we picture it as adventure, and the reality was closer to torture. You were in an open boat. Open. There was no cabin, no shelter, no below decks to escape to. You were exposed to the weather, all of it, for the entire voyage, which might last days or weeks. When it rained, you were rained on. When the waves broke over the side, and they did constantly, you were soaked in freezing seawater, and you stayed soaked, with no way to get dry, no warm cabin, no change into dry clothes that would only get soaked again. You were cold, deep cold, wet cold for the whole crossing. You bailed water endlessly, because the water came in and had to be got out, or you sank. You slept, if you slept at all, in the open, wet on the hard wood, jammed among your companions and the cargo. You ate cold food, or nothing. You were sick, most likely, heaving with the endless motion of the sea. And you did this for days on end, in the cold and the wet and the fear, with death a single big wave away the entire time. Could you survive that crossing? Not fight anyone at the end of it, just survive the journey itself, the cold and the wet and the exhaustion and the seasickness and the ever-present terror of the deep water. Most of us, I think, would be broken by it within a day, and there would be no turning back, no getting off. Nothing to do but endure it or die all the way across. And the longer voyages brought a slower killer with them, one they did not understand. On a crossing of weeks, living on dried and salted food with nothing fresh, the body itself began to fail, the gums to bleed and the teeth to loosen, old wounds to open again, the strength to drain away. Their sickness of long voyages and long winters that came from the lack of the fresh food they had no way to keep at sea. They did not know its cause. They only knew that men grew weak and ill, and sometimes died on the long passages and the long dark winters, their bodies quietly breaking down. It was one more thing waiting for you out on the grey water, a slow unraveling of the body itself, on top of the cold and the wet and the fear. Rest there a moment, strangely enough, because there is something to rest in even here. Picture the ship at night on a calm stretch, the sail full and steady, the water hissing quietly past the hull, the stars wheeling overhead, impossibly bright and thick in that clear northern air. More stars than you have ever seen, and the crew quiet, and the great dark sea all around, and the little wooden ship carrying its handful of lives across the face of the deep. There was a terror in it, but there was a wonder in it too, and they felt both. Feel that for a moment, the vast calm of it, before we remember how quickly that calm could turn into a killing storm. Because now let us talk about what they did when they reached the shore. The raiding. The thing the word Viking has come to mean. First, understand what a raid actually was, stripped of the romance. It was not a battle between armies. It was most often a sudden, brutal robbery with violence, carried out against people who could not defend themselves. The classic Viking raid fell upon a soft target, a monastery, a town, a village on the coast, a place with wealth and no walls and no warriors. The ships came out of the dawn, or out of nowhere, and the raiders leapt ashore and fell on the place before any defense could be raised, and they took everything of value they could carry, the gold and silver, the fine things, the stores of food, and above all the people, seized to be sold as slaves. And those who resisted were killed, and those who were too old or too weak to be worth selling were often killed, and the place was stripped and sometimes burned, and then they were gone, back to the ships, out to sea before anyone could gather to stop them. It was terror, that was the point of it. Sudden, overwhelming, merciless violence, striking without warning and vanishing before it could be answered. To the people of the lands they raided, the Vikings were a horror that came from the sea, and the fear of them spread across half a world, and prayers were written begging God to deliver people from their fury. The very first of the great raids, the one that announced the Viking Age to a horrified world, fell upon a holy island off the coast, a famous monastery, a place of peace and learning and treasure, utterly undefended, full of monks who had never imagined such a thing could happen. The raiders came out of the sea and fell upon it and killed and plundered and carried off the monks to sell. And the news of it went through the Christian world like a scream. People could not understand it. This holy place, they wrote, spattered with the blood of its priests, stripped of everything, trampled. It seemed to them a sign of the end of the world. And it was only the beginning. For the next 200 years and more, that terror would come again and again out of the sea, up the rivers, deep into the land, and no one who lived within reach of the water could ever feel entirely safe again. And do not lose sight under the horror of what the raids were really for, in the end, because it brings us back to you. They were for wealth, and a great part of that wealth was people. The Vikings were among the great slave traders of their age. The raids seized human beings by the thousand and carried them off and sold them along the long trade roads that ran all the way from the cold north down to the rich markets of the distant south, where a healthy captive fetched a good price. This was not a side business. It was one of the main engines of the whole Viking economy. The wealth that flowed back to the north, that bought the fine things and the silver, was in large part the price of sold human lives. And this is the fate we spoke of before, the one that would most likely have been yours. Not the raider on the deck, the captive in the hold, the person seized and bound and carried off across the sea and sold in a far market to spend the rest of a short life as someone's property. That was what the raids produced in their tens of thousands, and you would have been far likelier to be the cargo than the crew. Now here is the thing about you, dropped into this world. You imagine yourself perhaps as one of the raiders, and even that would likely be the end of you. Because raiding was not safe, even for the raiders. Not every target was soft. Sometimes the defenders were ready and armed, and the raid became a battle, and battle in that world was as savage and lethal a thing as has ever existed. But even setting the danger aside, could you do it? Could you leap off a ship into a strange town and cut down a man who was trying to defend his family? Could you take a weeping child from its mother's arms to sell it across the sea? Because if you could not, and I hope you could not, then you were no Viking raider, and you would have had no place among them and no share of the plunder that many families needed simply to survive. And if you could, then you had become something that your gentle modern soul can barely imagine, and it still might not have saved you, because the man in front of you had been training to fight since he could walk, and you had not. And in time the raids grew into something far larger and far more dangerous than a few ships descending on a monastery. Great armies formed, whole fleets, hundreds of ships, and thousands of warriors that did not just raid and leave but stayed and campaigned for years, marching through the lands they had come to plunder, fighting the kings who rose against them, wintering in fortified camps, conquering whole kingdoms. To be swept up in one of those great hosts was to spend years far from home, marching and fighting and starving and dying of disease in the camps, which killed more men than any battle ever did. Thousands of warriors crowded together in filth, with sickness running through them like fire. Many who sailed away with the great armies, dreaming of plunder and glory, never came home at all, and did not die gloriously in battle either, but wretchedly of a flux or a fever, in a muddy camp in a foreign land. That too was the Viking Age, and it too would very likely have been the end of you. Let us talk about that, about battle, because if the raid went wrong, or if you were caught up in one of the wars that were constant in that world, you would have to fight, and you would lose. Battle in the Viking Age was not the clean, choreographed thing of the films. It was a horror. Men fought hand to hand up close with axes and swords and spears, hacking and stabbing at one another's bodies, and the wounds were terrible, and there was no medicine to fix them. Weapons of that kind do not make neat wounds. An axe or a sword swung with the full strength of a strong man takes off limbs, splits skulls, opens bodies. We have the skeletons of men who died in those battles, and the bones tell the story in a way that is hard to read, cleaved and shattered and hacked. The marks of blades that struck again and again, from every angle, including the marks of blows that landed after the person was already down. Battle was a chaos of screaming and blood and terror, and men killing each other at arm's length with edged metal. And the ground became a slaughter yard, and the wounded who could not walk away were often finished where they lay, or left to die slowly of wounds that would fester and rot and kill them over the following days in agony. And think about what it would actually be like to stand there in the moments before the lines met. The noise, first the roar of it, the shouting and the war cries and the banging of weapons on shields. A wall of sound meant to break your nerve before a blow was ever struck. The press of bodies around you, your own side crushing in behind, so that you could not run even if you wished to. The smell of it, the sweat and the fear. The sight of the other line coming on, a moving wall of shields and iron and hard faces. And then the crash as the two walls met, and everything became noise and blood and pushing, and the blind, desperate work of trying to kill the man in front of you before he killed you, with no room to move, no way to flee, the dead and the dying underfoot, and no end to it until one side broke and the slaughter of the running began. That is what you would be dropped into, and every instinct in your gentle body, every impulse to freeze, to cower, to run, would be exactly the thing that got you killed in the first seconds. And to survive in that, to have any chance at all, you needed a lifetime of training and strength built by years of hard labor, and a shield you knew how to use, and the skill to stand in the shield wall. The line of overlapping shields where battles were decided, where you stood shoulder to shoulder with your companions and pushed and hacked at the enemy line while they hacked at yours, and where the moment your nerve broke or your shield dropped, or the man beside you fell and left you exposed, you died. You, with no training, no strength built for it, no skill with shield or blade, no experience of the sheer overwhelming terror of it, would last, in a real battle, a matter of seconds. You would be cut down almost before you understood what was happening. One more body in the slaughter, and it would not be heroic, and no saga would remember you. And you would not even have the weapons, most likely, because good weapons were expensive, and told you at a glance a man's place in that world. A sword above all was a treasure, costly, hard to make, owned only by those of some wealth, passed down through families, given names, buried with their owners. Many a Viking never owned one, and fought instead with a spear, which was cheaper, or with an axe, which was the tool of the farm turned to war, the weapon of the ordinary man. And over the arm, a round wooden shield, and if he was fortunate, a shirt of mail or a cap of iron. But these too were costly, and most men went into the slaughter with little more than a padded coat between their skin and the enemy's blade. You would be lucky, dropped into that world, to be handed a spear you did not know how to use, and sent to stand in a line of men who had trained for this their whole lives, against another line exactly like them, and the first real clash would be the last thing you ever knew. And there was in that world a thing that made the terror of battle worse, a kind of warrior spoken of in the old tales, men who worked themselves into a frenzy before the fight, who seemed to feel no pain and no fear, who bit their shields and howled and threw themselves into the slaughter like mad things, beyond reason, beyond stopping. Whatever the truth behind the tales, whether it was a fury summoned by ritual or a rage of the mind, or something taken to bring it on, the point for you is simple. You might find yourself facing a man like that, a man who had become, for the length of the battle, something barely human, who would not stop and could not be reasoned with and felt nothing as he came for you. And against such a thing, your gentle modern self would have no answer at all. And even if you were not killed outright, there were the wounds, and the wounds might be worse than death. Imagine taking a deep wound in that world. There was no way to stop serious bleeding, no way to repair the damage inside, and above all, no understanding of infection and no way to fight it. A wound that we would clean and stitch and treat without a thought was, in that world, very often a slow death sentence. The wound would fester, it would swell and redden and fill with corruption, and the poison would spread through the body, and the fever would come, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch and try useless remedies, and wait, while the wounded person burned and raved and slowly died, days or weeks after the battle that everyone else had already walked away from. To be wounded was often simply to die more slowly, and the things they tried, the hot iron to seal a wound, the crude attempts to cut or burn away the rot, without any pain relief beyond strong drink, were horrors in themselves, agonies inflicted on the already suffering, and mostly they did not work. There is a grim little test from the old tales that tells you everything about the medicine of that world. To find out whether a man had taken a mortal wound to the belly, they would feed him a strong-smelling broth of onion and herbs, and then, after a time, smell the wound. And if they could smell the onion coming through it, they knew the gut had been pierced, and that the man would die, and that there was nothing to be done. That was the height of their skill, not a cure, but a way of knowing, from the smell of onions, which of the wounded were already as good as dead. And if that was you, gut wounded on some far shore, there would be no help, no surgery, no relief, only that grim sniff of confirmation, and then the days of fever and agony, while your own body poisoned itself, and the waiting for the end. Rest a moment from all that blood, gently, because it is a great deal to carry, and there is more to that world than its violence. Remember that most Vikings, most of the time, were not in battle at all. They were on the farm, in the ordinary hard life we spoke of before. The violence was real and it was terrible, but it was not every day, and even in that hard world there was laughter and love and feasting and friendship, and the telling of tales by the fire. Let yourself step back from the battlefield for a moment into the warm hall, where the same people who could be so terrible in war sat together in the firelight and drank and laughed and were, for a while, at peace. That was real too. It was all real, the horror and the warmth together, and that is what makes them human, and not the cartoon the stories make of them. But now let us speak of the gods, because the gods of that world would not have kept you safe. They would have wanted their share of blood. The Vikings, before they became Christian, worshipped the old gods of the north, and those were not gentle gods. They were powerful and dangerous and demanding, gods of war and storm and death and fate, and the world they described was a hard and fated one, moving toward a final darkness that even the gods could not escape. And they were worshipped in part with sacrifice, with blood, because the gods gave nothing for nothing, and to gain their favor you had to give something up, something living, something that mattered. Animals were sacrificed, many of them, at the great festivals, killed and offered to the gods and then eaten in the feast that followed. The blood sprinkled on the people and the walls and the images of the gods. But it was not only animals. At the greatest and most solemn of the sacrifices, at certain holy places, at certain terrible times, human beings were offered too. Prisoners, slaves, sometimes it seems, even people of rank, killed in various ways and hung in the sacred groves, or sunk in the holy pools, or buried in the earth, given to the gods to buy their favor or turn aside their anger. Travelers from the south who saw these sacred places wrote of them with horror, of the bodies of men and animals hanging together among the trees, rotting, offered to the northern gods. That was the faith of that world. It was not a comfort in the way we think of faith. It was a hard bargain with hard powers, sealed in blood. And you, in that world, might well have been the sacrifice. A stranger, a slave, a person of no account and no kin to protect them, was exactly the kind of life that world might decide to give to its gods. You would not be a worshipper, safe in the crowd. You would be, quite possibly, the thing on the altar, the one given up. And there would be nothing you could do about it, because to them it would not be murder. It would be an offering, a holy and necessary thing, and your death would be a gift that brought a good harvest or a fair wind. And they would feel not guilt but gratitude, and you would be gone. And there is a particular horror that we know of, recorded by a traveler from the south who witnessed the funeral of a great man among the northern people, and it shows exactly how a life like yours might end in that world. When a chief died, it was not only his body that went into the grave or the fire. His wealth went with him, his weapons, his animals, his ship, and, at the greatest funerals, a slave, chosen to die and accompany the master into the next world. The traveler described it in detail. A young enslaved woman given drink, passed among the mourners, and then, at the end, taken into the dead man's ship amid the beating of shields to cover her cries, and killed there and burned with her master, so that she might serve him still beyond death. That happened. It was witnessed and written down. And you, a person with no kin and no worth to that world beyond your body, might have been exactly the one chosen to die at a stranger's funeral for a belief that was not even your own. And even beyond the sacrifices, the whole spirit of that world would have been deadly to you because of what they believed about death and courage and fate. They believed, many of them, that the manner of your death mattered more than almost anything, that to die well, bravely, in battle, weapon in hand, was the finest thing, the thing that might win you a place in the hall of the slain, feasting with the gods until the end of the world. And to die badly, in your bed, of old age or sickness, was a lesser and a shameful end. This belief made them fearless in a way that is hard for us to grasp, willing to run toward death, to take mad risks, to fight when they should have fled, because the fighting itself and the brave death, if it came, was the point, and behind it all lay a belief darker still and strangely magnificent, that even the gods themselves were doomed. For the northern faith told of a final battle at the end of the world, a day when the gods would go out to fight the forces of darkness and chaos, and would lose, and the world would be destroyed, and even the greatest of the gods would fall. They believed, in other words, that the story did not have a happy ending, that everything, gods and men and the world itself, was moving toward a final darkness that could not be avoided, only faced. And the only thing that mattered, in the face of that, was how you met it, whether you met your fate with courage, whether you did what was right and brave, even knowing it would not save you. It was a hard, grim, magnificent way to see the world, and it bred a hard, grim courage. And it would have offered you no comfort at all and no safety, only the demand that you too face a doom you could not escape without flinching the way they did. And that fearlessness, that whole code, would have gotten you killed very quickly because you do not share it and you could not fake it. You would flinch when you should stand. You would flee when honor demanded you hold. You would value your own life sensibly, in a world that despised a man who valued his life too highly. And in doing so, you would mark yourself, again and again, as a coward by their lights, as a person of no honor. And in that world, a person of no honor was a person anyone could kill or cheat or enslave without consequence. Your very good sense, your reasonable modern desire to stay alive, would be, in that world, a kind of fatal weakness, and it would be seen and it would be punished, and the code cut the other way too, and that would have trapped you just as surely. For honor demanded not only that you be brave, but that you answer every wrong and never let an injury pass. If a member of your family was killed, you were bound to avenge it, to take a life in return, or to demand payment for it, and if you did neither, you were shamed, and your whole family with you. And so the killings ran on, back and forth for years, for generations, one death demanding another. and the answer to that demanding another, still whole families locked into long feuds of revenge that could smolder for a lifetime and claim life after life. To live in that world was to be caught in that web, bound to kill for wrongs you might wish to forgive, bound to keep a quarrel alive that you might long to end, because to let it go was to be shamed, and to be shamed was to be prey. You who would want only to be left in peace, to forgive, to walk away, would find that there was no walking away, that the code held you as tightly as it held everyone, and that your gentleness, your wish for peace, would be read not as virtue but as weakness, and would invite the very violence you longed to avoid. And there was a formal side to it too, a way of settling a quarrel that was no comfort at all. If you were challenged or gave offense, you could be called to a duel, a fight on a marked patch of ground, by rules, to first blood or to the death. And to refuse the challenge was itself a disgrace so deep that a man who refused could be branded a coward-in-law, losing his honor and his standing altogether. So you could be forced to fight, forced by the code itself, whether you wished it or not, against a man who very likely knew far better than you how to use a blade. To accept was to risk death at his hands. To refuse was to become a nothing, a shamed man, fair game for anyone. There was no good answer for you. There was only the trap closing either way. We have covered a great deal of dying tonight. The sea that drowns, the raid that goes wrong, the battle that cuts you down, the wound that rots, the gods that want your blood, the code of honor that kills the careful. And through all of it runs the same hard truth we found in the ordinary life of the farm, which is that this was a world with no softness in it, no safety net, no mercy for weakness, no second chances, and that you, shaped by a gentle age into a gentle person, would have found in it 100 ways to die and almost none to live. But we are not quite done. There is one more part of this story, and in some ways it is the saddest and the most important, because it is the end of all of it. Next time we will speak of the body and its slow defeat, of the diseases that rotted them from within, of the short, hard span of a Viking life and how it ended, and of how the whole Viking world itself in time grew old and faded and died and passed away into the very history that now, 1,000 years later, lulls us gently towards sleep. We will lay the whole world to rest and ourselves with it, but not tonight. Tonight let the ships come home. Let them run up onto the beach in the last of the light. The voyage survived, the sea cheated one more time, and let the crews go up to the warm halls and let the fires be lit, and let there be for one night no storm and no battle and no blood, only the warmth and the rest, and the safety of having come home alive one more time. So let your breathing slow and be glad, so deeply glad that the sea does not wait for you tonight, that no raid will come out of your dawn, that no wound will fester and no altar will claim you, that you are safe and warm and far, so impossibly far from all of it, in your own gentle age. Feel how fortunate you are. Feel it and let it hold you. And spare one last quiet thought as you drift off for those hard sailors of the cold seas long ago who crossed the grey water in open boats under the wheeling stars and stood in the shield wall and gave their blood to their hard gods and lived, most of them, such short and difficult and dangerous lives, and faced it all somehow with a courage that still echoes down 1,000 years. They are all gone now, every one of them. The sea grown quiet, the ships long rotted, the shield walls fallen silent forever. Let them rest out on the far side of time, and rest yourself, warm and safe, and sleep. Let the sea grow calm now in your mind, and the wind fall, and the great grey waves sink slowly back into stillness. Let the ships come to rest on the quiet beaches of 1,000 years ago, their voyaging done, their crews long gone to their rest. Let the shields be laid down, and the fires burn low in the halls, and the whole hard, violent, beautiful old world settle into the deep quiet of the past, where it can harm no one, and least of all you. You are not on the sea tonight. There is no storm coming for you, no shore full of enemies, no altar, no wound, no long dark crossing. You are here, warm, dry, safe, held in the gentle world that all their hard living, in the end, helped to build. Be glad of it. Be glad all the way down to your bones. So let your breathing slow and let the last of the day dissolve, and let the ship sail on into the dark of history without you, growing smaller and fainter and finally still. The voyage is over, the sea is quiet, and you are safe and warm and free to rest. Sleep now. The tide has gone out for the last time 1,000 years ago, and it will never reach you here. We have tried across these nights to kill you many times over. We have frozen you in the long dark winter and worked you to death on the hard northern farm and starved you in the hungry spring. We have drowned you in the cold grey sea and cut you down in the shield wall and let your wounds rot slowly after the battle was won. We have put you on the altar and sold you into slavery and trapped you in the deadly code of honor. And through all of it, one truth has held, which is that you, a gentle person of a gentle age, would not have lasted long in the world of the Vikings. But tonight we come to the last of it, and it is the quietest killer of all, and the surest. Because even if you had done everything right, even if you had survived the cold and the work and the hunger and the sea and the sword, there was one enemy you could never outrun, one that came for everyone, the strong and the weak, the lucky and the doomed alike, the slow enemy, the body itself, wearing out, breaking down, giving way, far sooner than yours ever will, in a world that had no way to save it. Tonight we speak of sickness, and of the short hard span of a Viking life and of how it ended. And then we speak of how the whole Viking world itself grew old and faded and died, and passed away into the quiet of history, where it now, 1,000 years later, rests and helps us gently to rest ourselves. And I want to promise you, before we begin, that although this last night is about death, it does not end in the cold. It ends in something warmer than anything we have found yet, a truth about these hard people that redeems all their suffering, and that may, if you let it, warm you too as you drift off. So bear with me through the dying, because there is light at the end of it, the gentlest light of all. We have spent these nights learning why you could not have survived that world. We will end by learning why they did, and what they found worth living for in the teeth of everything. And it is the most human and most hopeful thing in the whole long tale. But before we begin, if these journeys into the far cold past have brought you any peace across these nights, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would love to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, in whatever warm and gentle place has you, where are you listening from and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It has been a quiet joy, all of us gathered here in the warm across all these nights, while the hard old world turns and fades in our minds. And now, one last time, let your shoulders come down and let your breathing slow, and let the whole weight of your day dissolve and drift away. Come with me back to the world of the North one final time to see how it ended for a person and for a people, and to lay it all gently to rest. Let us begin with the thing that killed more Vikings than any sword ever did. Not battle, not the sea, disease. This is the truth that the sagas never tell you, because it is not glorious and it is not exciting, but it is the plain fact of that world and every world before our own. The great killer was never the enemy. It was the invisible enemy, the sickness that came in the night, the fever that took the child, the flux that emptied a body of life in a few days, the cough that settled in the chest through the long damp winter and never left. These were the things that actually ended most lives in the Viking Age, quietly, in the smoky dark of the Longhouse, far from any battlefield. And they had no idea what caused any of it. None. They did not know that tiny living things, far too small to see, swarmed in the water they drank and the food they ate and the wounds they took and the air they breathed. They had never imagined such a thing, and so they had no way to fight it, no way to prevent it, no true medicine at all, only herbs and charms and prayers and the strong drink that dulled the pain, none of which could touch the real cause. When sickness came, it simply ran its course, and the person lived or died according to the strength of their own body and nothing else, and there was nothing anyone could do but wait and tend them and hope and so often grieve. Think of the ways that world could kill you with sickness, all of them invisible, all of them beyond understanding. The water itself could kill you, carrying diseases that would empty your body of its life in a matter of days, and in a crowded settlement, with people and animals close together, and no understanding of cleanliness as we know it. Such things could spread and kill many. The food could kill you, spoiled without your knowing, or preserved wrong, or simply run out. The air of the crowded winter house, thick with smoke, and breathed over and over by many people packed together, carried the coughing sicknesses of the lungs from one to another through the long, dark months. A small cut, a scratch, a splinter, anything that broke the skin, could let in an infection that would swell and spread and kill you from a wound so small you had forgotten it. Your very teeth, worn down by the gritty bread to painful stumps, could rot and abscess and poison you, and there was no dentist, no relief, only the grinding pain and sometimes the spreading infection that killed. The whole world was full of invisible ways to die, and they could not see a single one of them, and neither dropped among them could you. And there were worse things than the quick fevers, slow things that ate away at a body over years. There were parasites, worms, that lived inside people, sharing their food from the inside, draining their strength, so common that we find their traces in almost everyone from that age. There were the wasting sicknesses that came from the poor, hard diet, that softened the bones and rotted the gums and drained the life. And there were the diseases that disfigured and destroyed slowly, the ones that ate away at the flesh and the face over years, and we find their marks on the bones of that world, people who lived for a long time with their bodies slowly being consumed, with no cure, no relief, no hope, only the slow, certain progress of the thing devouring them. To fall ill in that world was not always to die quickly. Sometimes it was to be given instead a long, slow sentence, carried out over years, with nothing anyone could do but watch. And so people did not live long. This is one of the hardest things for us to take in. We who expect our 60 years and 10 and often much more. In the Viking world, to reach 40 was to be old. To reach 50 was rare. Many, so many, died as children, as we have said, and of those who survived to grow up, a great number were gone by their 30s and 40s, worn out, broken down, carried off by sickness or by the slow accumulated damage of a life of relentless hardship. The old, truly old, the grey elders full of years existed, but they were few, the tough survivors of a whole generation that had mostly died around them. The world was young, in a way ours is not, full of the strong and the striving, because so few lived long enough to be anything else. And the bones of these people tell us, plainly and without pity, what those short lives did to them. When we dig them up and read what is written in them, we find bodies marked everywhere by hardship, spines worn and bent from a lifetime of heavy lifting and carrying begun in childhood, joints ground down and thickened by endless labor, the knees and shoulders and hips of people who worked hard every day of their lives, old broken bones healed crooked because there was no one to set them properly, teeth worn to the root and abscessed, the marks of times of starvation written into the very growth of the bones, lines that record the winters when a child nearly died of hunger and lived. These were not soft people, and their bodies were not spared. By the time they reached what we would call middle age, if they reached it at all, they were often worn out, aged before their time, their bodies used up by a life that used everything up. You, whose body has never known a fraction of that labor, would have worn out faster still, or more likely never have lasted long enough to wear out at all. And to grow old there, in the rare event that you did, was its own hard fate. There was no ease in old age, no comfortable retirement, no rest earned at the end of a life of labor. If you could still work, you worked, as long as your body would let you, because every hand was needed, and there was no other way. And when at last you could not, when you were too old or too broken to be useful, you became a burden on a household that lived always at the edge of enough, another mouth to feed through the hungry winter when the food was short. In the very hardest times, in the very hardest places, that was a dangerous thing to be. There are dark hints in the old stories of a time when the useless old were not always kept, when in a bitter winter, an elder might be expected to make way to go out into the cold, to take themselves off so that the young and the strong might have their share of the food. Whether and how often such things truly happened we cannot know, but the very fact that the stories remember it tells you how close to the bone that world could cut, how little room there was, at the end, for those who could no longer pull their weight. And imagine the weight of that on an old person in a hard winter. To know that your own weakness was a danger to the ones you loved, that every bite you ate was a bite taken from a grandchild, that your long survival, your hard-won years had become a burden on the very people you had spent your life keeping alive. It is a cruelty we can barely conceive of, we who honor and care for our old or try to. But it was not cruelty in that world. It was the same terrible arithmetic that decided whether a newborn was kept, applied now at the other end of life. In a world always at the edge of starvation, the group had to survive. And sometimes the group could not carry those who could not carry themselves. That the old were honored and loved and listened to, and that this too was true, all at the same time, only makes it harder and more human. They loved their old and depended on their wisdom, and in the worst extremity might still lose them to the cold and grieve them and go on. That was the knife edge they lived on, all their lives, at both ends of them. Rest there a moment gently, because it is a sad thought and I do not want to leave you in the cold of it. Think instead of what it means about the ones who did grow old. An old Viking, a grey elder full of years, was a person who had survived everything. The childhood that killed half, the winters and the hungers, the sicknesses that had carried off most of the people they had ever known, the sea, perhaps, and the battles. They were the last ones standing, the tough remainder, and they were honored for it, and their words carried weight because they had seen so much and lived through all of it. The knowledge of that world, its skills and its stories, and its hard-won wisdom, lived in those few old heads and was passed down by them to the young by the fire in the long dark. And that was how a people carried itself forward through time. To be old was rare and hard, but it was also in its way a kind of victory, the final proof that you had been all along, one of the ones strong enough to survive. And in a world with no books, or almost none, the old were something more than wise. They were the memory of the whole people. Everything that world knew it kept not on paper, but in living minds, and the oldest minds held the most. How to read the weather and the sea, how to heal as far as healing went, the lineages, who was descended from whom, which mattered enormously in a world of kin and feud and inheritance, the law itself, memorized and recited by those who held it, and the stories, the great tales of gods and heroes and ancestors, carried in memory and passed down by voice generation to generation for hundreds of years. When an old person died in that world, a library burned. A whole store of knowledge and story and memory went into the ground with them, unless they had passed it on in time. And so the young gathered close to the old by the winter fire and listened and learned and remembered, because that listening was how the world kept itself, how a people held on to who they were across the centuries. There was a deep bond in that, between the very old and the very young, the passing of the flame from the ones who were leaving to the ones just arriving, and it was one of the most beautiful things in that hard world. Now let me tell you how a life ended there, when it ended, because even death was harder in that world, and there was no gentle going. We die, most of us, in comfort now, or at least in the attempt at comfort, with medicine to ease the pain, with people to tend us, in a warm bed. In the Viking world, there was almost none of that. People died as they had lived, hard and often in pain with nothing to ease the passage. They died of wounds that rotted, in fever and agony. They died of sicknesses that racked the body, with no relief. They died in childbirth, in blood and terror. They died of the slow failing of a body worn out too soon by labor and cold and hunger. And they died so often, in the depth of winter, in the cold and the dark, when the body is weakest and the sicknesses are worst and the food is shortest, so that the long night of the north was also, quite literally, the season of dying, when the weak and the old and the sick slipped away in the darkness, and the living could sometimes not even bury them until the spring came, and the frozen ground softened enough to dig. Think of what that meant, to lose someone in the deep of winter, and to be unable even to lay them in the earth. The dead had to wait, sometimes for months, held over until the ground would take them, while the living carried on around them through the long, dark, grieving, waiting for the spring to come so that they could finally do the last thing for the ones they had lost. And when at last the earth softened and the burial came, it was done with what care and what ceremony the family could manage, the body laid in the ground or the mound with the things it would need, and words said, and the grief held so long, finally let out under the returning sun. There was love in that, and ritual, and a fierce determination to send the dead off properly, whatever it cost, however long the wait. But there was no softness in it, and no ease, and no sparing of the ones who mourned. Death in that world was as hard as everything else in it, and it asked of the living a strength that we, who are spared so much, can barely imagine. And you, who have never truly suffered, who have never known real pain that could not be reached for a pill to ease, who expect, quite reasonably, to die old and cared for and as gently as may be, would have found the dying of that world as hard as the living. There would have been no softness at the end, any more than there was in the middle, only the same hard world, seeing you out the way it had brought you in the cold and the dark, without mercy and without relief. And yet, here is the thing I want you to hold as we come to the end of all this dying, because it matters and it changes everything. They were not miserable. That is the great surprise and the great lesson of looking honestly at a world like theirs. You would think, would you not, that a life so hard, so short, so full of death and danger and pain, must have been a wretched thing, a thing of unrelieved suffering. And it was not. We know it was not. Because those same people, in the same hard world, also feasted and laughed and loved. They made beautiful things, jewelry and carving and poetry of astonishing skill and beauty, things they did not need to make to survive. Things they made simply because the making of beauty is one of the deepest things people do. They told stories, wonderful stories, funny and tragic and wise, by the fire in the long dark, and treasured the ones who could tell them well. They loved their children, the ones who lived fiercely, and grieved the ones who died. They had friends they would die for, and did. They had feasts that were remembered for years, nights of ale and song and laughter in the warm hall while the storm raged outside. They found in the middle of all that hardness real joy, real warmth, real meaning, real love. Think of the beauty they made, with hands hardened by labor, in a world that gave them every excuse to make nothing at all. They took plain iron and made blades with patterns like running water, worked into the very metal. They took wood and antler and bone and carved them into flowing, twisting, intricate designs, animals and knots and patterns that wound and interlaced with a skill that still takes the breath away. They made jewelry of silver and gold, brooches and arm rings and pendants, fine and delicate and lovely, and wore it and treasured it and were buried with it. They loved games, and we find their gaming pieces in the graves, boards and playing pieces of glass and bone, because even in that hard world, people sat by the fire of a winter evening and played and laughed and competed, as people always have. They composed poetry of a complexity that scholars still marvel at, dense and clever and rich, and prized a person who could make it and remembered the best of it for generations. This was not a brutish people scrabbling in the dark. This was a people who, in the teeth of a world that was trying to kill them, still reached for beauty and made it, and filled their hard lives with it. And they loved. That is the thing that comes through most of all across all the centuries, from the graves and the stories alike. They loved their families and stood by their kin, and mourned their dead with real grief. We find them buried with care, with the things they had loved in life, laid in the earth or the ship by people who wanted them to have those things still, wherever they were going. We find husbands and wives buried together, and children buried with small treasures, tiny beads and toys, by parents who could not bear to send them into the dark with nothing. Across 1,000 years, from the silence of the graves, the love of these hard people reaches us, as strong and as tender as any love we know. They were not strangers to the heart. They felt everything we feel as deeply as we feel it, in lives 100 times harder than ours. And that, in the end, is the truest thing this whole long story has to teach us, and the gentlest, and the one I most want to leave you with. That people can be happy in the hardest of worlds, that joy does not wait for comfort, and meaning does not require ease. And love grows as strong in the cold and the dark as it does in the warm and the light, perhaps stronger because it is needed more. Those hard people of the cold north, living lives that would break us, dying young and in pain in a world without mercy, were not for all that a miserable people. They were a people who lived fully and fiercely every hard day they were given, and found warmth in each other, and beauty in their work, and joy in their feasts, and meaning in their fierce hard code, and who faced a world that was trying to kill them with a courage and even a humor that still reaches us across 1,000 years. They did not survive because they were grim. They survived because they were strong, and they found in the surviving things worth living for. Now let me tell you, at the last, how their whole world ended, because it did end, and there is a gentleness in how it went. But first, a word about what they believed waited on the other side of all that dying, because it is not what you might expect from so hard a people, and there is a strange comfort in it. They did not, most of them, fear death the way we might imagine, for they believed that death was not an ending but a passage, a journey to another place, and they prepared for it with great care. They buried their dead with the things they would need on the far side, their tools, their weapons, their jewelry, their food, sometimes their animals, sometimes, at the greatest funerals, a whole ship, a real sea-going ship, hauled up onto the land and buried in the earth or set alight, to carry the dead person across to whatever came next. Think of that. They gave their dead a ship, one of the most precious and hard-won things their whole world could make, because they could not bear to send them on the last voyage without a vessel to carry them. And where were they going in those buried ships? To many places, in their belief. The bravest of the fallen, the warriors who died well, went to the great hall of the slain, to feast and fight and be merry until the end of the world. Others went to other halls, other realms, kinder ones, quieter ones. There was a place for those who died at sea, and a place ruled by a goddess, and the belief was less a single map than a rich tangle of hopes and stories about where the dead went and what waited for them. But underneath all of it lay the same deep human thing that we saw in the Egyptians, so far away and so different, and that we find in almost every people who has ever lived. The refusal to believe that those we love simply end. The hope held hard against all the evidence of the cold ground that death is a door and that on the other side of it there is something, a hall, a feast, a reunion, a going on. Even these hard people of the cold north, who knew death better than we ever will, could not accept that it was the end. And they sent their dead off in ships with all their treasures, toward a horizon they could not see but chose, against everything, to believe in. There is a great tenderness in that when you sit with it, and it draws the sting from all the dying we have spoken of. These people who saw so much death, who buried so many, did not despair. They hoped. They built their hope into their very graves, into the buried ships pointing out toward the unknown, and they sent their loved ones on with everything they had, in the faith that it was not goodbye forever. And whether they were right or wrong, the hoping itself is one of the most human and most beautiful things about them, and one of the gentlest notes to end on, as we lay their whole world down to rest. The Viking Age did not end in a great catastrophe, any more than the fall of Rome did. It faded. Slowly, over generations, the world that had produced the raiders and the longships changed, and became something else, and the Viking as such simply ceased to be. Several things wore it away together. The lands they had raided grew stronger and better defended and organized against them, so that raiding became harder and more dangerous and less rewarding, until at last it was not worth the risk. The Vikings themselves, the ones who had gone out to raid and settle, put down roots in the lands they had come to, married into them, took up their ways, became simply a part of the places they had once terrorized. Their grandchildren no longer raiders but farmers and traders and lords like any other. And their kingdoms at home grew into settled, ordinary kingdoms, with kings and laws and towns, no longer launching pads for plunder but countries among countries. And above all, the faith changed. The old gods, the hard gods of war and blood and fate, gave way, over the generations, to the new faith that was spreading across all the north, the faith of the one God, of mercy and forgiveness that came up from the south, and slowly, kingdom by kingdom, family by family, replaced the old ways. The sacred groves where the sacrifices had hung were cut down, the old gods faded into stories and then into memory, and the people who had once feared them became, in time, worshippers of a gentler God, buried now in churchyards with the sign of the new faith over them, their fierce old ancestors already half legend. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen easily. For a long time the two faiths lived side by side, and there were those who wore the symbols of both, hedging their bets, honoring the new God without quite letting go of the old ones. There were kings who forced the new faith on their people, sometimes with great violence, and people who clung to the old gods in secret in the remote places for generations after the kings had turned. It was the passing of a whole way of seeing the world, and such things do not pass without pain, but pass it did. The hard-fated world of the old gods, the world that expected no mercy and promised none, gave way in the end to the gentler promises of the new faith, and something changed in the soul of the North, softened, quieted, and the age of the raiders drew toward its close, along with the age of their gods. And historians often mark the end of the whole age with a single great battle, far from the northern homelands, where a great Viking army, the last of the old kind, came for a kingdom it meant to conquer as its ancestors had conquered, and was met, and was broken, and was destroyed. The king who led it, one of the last great warriors of the old world, was killed, and it was said that the survivors of that great host sailed home in only a fraction of the ships they had come in. So many were the dead. And though it was only one battle, and the world did not change in a day, later ages looked back on it and saw in it the moment the tide finally turned, the last great reaching out of the old Viking world, broken on the shore of a new age that no longer had room for it. After that the raids dwindled, and the old way faded, and the thing was at last over. And so the Viking age closed, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet fading, as the raiders became settlers, and the settlers became citizens, and the old gods gave way to the new, and the long ships were drawn up on the beach for the last time and left to rot, and the world moved on. The people did not vanish. Their blood runs in millions of people alive today across many lands. Their words are woven into languages still spoken. Their stories are still told, still loved, still turned into the tales and the shows that we know. But the Viking, the thing itself, that particular hard, bright, dangerous way of being in the world, passed away, gently, into history, and became what it is to us now. A story, a legend, a thing to wonder at, and tonight a thing to fall asleep to. And they left more behind them than we often remember. We think of them as destroyers, and they destroyed much, but they built too, and made, and gave. They founded towns and cities that still stand and thrive today, great trading places that grew from their harbors and their markets. They opened up trade routes that ran across half the world, knitting together lands that had never touched before, carrying goods and silver and ideas from the Far East to the Far West. The very days of our week, in some languages, still carry the names of their old gods, spoken by people who have long forgotten where the names came from. Words we use every day, common ordinary words, came into our speech from theirs, so that we speak a little of the Viking tongue without ever knowing it. They were great settlers and farmers as well as raiders, and turned wild lands to the plough, and their descendants became kings and founders of nations far from the cold north. The mark they left on the world was not only the mark of the axe, it was the mark of the plough and the ship and the market and the word, and it is still there all around us, woven so deep into the world we live in that we walk past it every day and never see it. So they did not truly vanish, any more than the great peoples of the ancient world truly vanished. They changed and they passed on, and they left their traces everywhere, in our blood and our words and our maps and our stories, so that 1,000 years later, on the far side of the world, we are still talking about them, still telling their tales, still falling asleep to the memory of them. That is a kind of immortality too, perhaps the only kind there really is. They wanted those hard people to be remembered, to have their names live on, to earn a place in the stories that would be told by the fire long after they were gone. And they got it, beyond anything they could have dreamed. We remember them still. We will remember them always. And on this quiet night, 1,000 years on, we have remembered them together. And there is one last story from that world that says everything, gently and sadly, about how a whole way of life can end. Far out on the edge of everything, on the shore of a great frozen island at the very rim of the known world, the Vikings had planted a colony, the farthest of all their settlements, a little cluster of farms clinging to the green edges of a land of ice. And for a while it lived. For generations they farmed there, and kept their animals and built their church, and traded across the cold sea at the very end of the world. And then, slowly, it died. The weather turned colder over the years, and the crossings grew harder, and the ships came less often, and the little colony at the edge of the world was left more and more alone. And they held on, growing poorer, growing fewer, their world shrinking around them, their contact with home fading to nothing. And then one year there was no one left. The last of them died or gave up at the edge of the ice, alone, forgotten, at the very end of the Viking world, and no one even knows exactly when or how the last one went. The farms fell empty, the cold came in, and the story ended, out there in the silence, with no one to tell it. There is a whole world in that small, sad ending. The reaching out, so bold and so far, the holding on so long and so hard, and then the quiet fading, the growing alone, and the final silence at the edge of the ice. That was the Viking Age in the end, writ small, a bright hard reaching out into the world, and then a slow, quiet fading back into the dark and the cold and the silence of history. So let it rest now. Let the whole hard world of the North lie down at last, its long day over, its work done, its dying finished forever. Let the long ships settle into the mud of the fjords and the earth of the burial mounds, where the archaeologists find them now, 1,000 years on, and marvel. Let the old gods sleep in their faded stories. Let the shield walls stay fallen and the raids stay ended, and the cold hard winters of long ago lie quiet and harmless in the deep past, where they can never reach you. And let the people rest, all of them, the farmers and the raiders, the women at the looms and the men at the oars, the children who died and the elders who somehow lived, the drowned and the fallen and the ones who simply wore out, all of them, every hard and striving one of them, gone now, at peace for 1,000 years, their long winters over, their fires long cold, their struggle finished at last. They lived through what would have ended us. They bore what we could not bear, and they have earned their rest as you have earned yours. Let them sail on in your mind out past the last headland, into the quiet. Picture it, if it helps you drift, the long ship on the still evening water, its work all done, moving slowly away toward a horizon of soft gold, carrying all of them, the whole hard, bright, vanished world, gently out of sight. There is no storm now. There is no battle waiting. There is only the calm water and the fading light, and the long ship growing smaller and smaller, and the deep peace of a thing that is finally completely over and at rest. There is nothing for you to carry from any of it. You do not have to feed the fire or fear the sea or answer the challenge or face the winter. You are not of that world, and you never had to be, and that is the greatest fortune there is, and I hope after these nights you feel it in your bones. How lucky you are, how gently your own life is held, how much was suffered by how many so that you could lie here now, warm and safe and free. So let your breathing slow, one last time. Let the fires of the north burn low, and the long ships fade into the dark, and the whole old hard world grow quiet and quieter, and slip away into the deep, gentle silence of things that are long over and finally at peace. You are warm. You are safe. You are here in your own kind age, and all of that was long, long ago. Be grateful as you drift off for the softness of your world, and spare one last kind thought for the hard people who never knew it, and then let them go, gently, into their long rest, and follow them down into yours. Sleep now, it is over. It has been over for 1,000 years, and you are warm and safe and free, and it is time at last to rest.